Everyone joining us today for our presentation around Are You Actually Covered? Navigating Cyber Liability Insurance in 2025. Today, presentation is given to you by someone here from Kyber Security as well as Cambridge Insurance, experts in the field. Start by introducing our first presenter, Bob Thomas from Kyber Security. Bob's been here for about 1,000 years, or actually since 2004. He came in as an acquisition when he sold his company in. Works with our clients all day, every day, helping keep them secure and productive through the use of cybersecurity techniques and other types of technology. He's carried just about every role that can happen in this business, and is a great wealth of resource. He'll be helping us through understanding the cyber landscape, and a little bit about insurance before we turn it over to Sean. So, Bob,
Take it away, as they say.
take it away.
All right. Thanks very much, Mike. And I'm happy to be here to talk a little bit about this subject. We've had multiple discussions with clients about it and why they need it, why they should have it. And I think this will maybe bring some clarity to that subject. And one of the things, there's a multitude of reasons that people have cyber liability insurance or have considered it. And even folks that wanted to get it and couldn't get it for certain reasons. We're going to talk about that. But it all typically rests around data protection and how do I protect my data today? And in addition to that, what's really at risk? And having a data breach exposes, obviously what you consider to be valuable data for your business. Could be financial. But I think the real thing is this is people that are exfiltrating, pulling data out of your environment, maybe corrupting your valuable data. Is there anything that is of value that you can picture in your environment that they would either encrypt so you can't access it, or they've pulled it out of your environment and are trying to use it for ransom or try to sell it on the dark web? Those are things that you have to think about when you're talking about a data breach, where that data resides. But anybody, this is not just a personal thing. This is not just the enterprise level. This is everybody has some form of data that they consider valuable or that they should be considering valuable. And if they're without it, what are they going to do? How are they going to conduct business? How are you going to be able to service your clients? And I think that's really the most important thing to think about when you're talking about data and a breach. You go to the next slide, Mike. So I talked a little bit about this, but to get into the specifics, this is what we're talking about when we say what kind of data is out there and what's important to folks that are owning and running a business. Obviously there's huge acronyms that go along with our business, but PII, it's personally identifiable information, is a biggie. People say, well, I don't really collect that. Well, you probably have it on your employees, so you certainly have some of it. Whether you have it in volume and how you collect it, it really starts to expand the landscape. Same thing applies to PHI. You don't have to necessarily be a healthcare provider or a doctor's office, a surgical practice in order to have protected health information. You may have some of that on your clients. You have insurance policies and major medical benefits that you offer your team. Well, a lot of times there's claim detail that gets funneled back to the insurance provider, the company that actually holds the policy. Our firm, for instance, we have a policy, and that data gets back to us. Same thing with ePHI. So it doesn't have to be in paper form. It can be in electronic form, in the form of explanation of benefits. EOBs are pretty popular and have a lot of data on them. If that's someplace in your organization, and that's the Health and Human Services involved. You've got to report it to them, Attorney General. There's all sorts of compliancy around that is mandatory. And any company confidential information, start to think about, IP, intellectual property, financial data, anything that makes your organization tick and makes you different than other organizations and competitors of yours. That fell into the wrong hands. Your client list, all of that is, you're intending it to be private information. If that gets out into the wild, now you have a really big problem. And I'm sure there's people that would pay money, good money, to get their hands on that type of data if it were available.
And Bob, we actually had Robert join as well, and just making this a little bit interactive. And Robert, obviously, thanks for taking the time to join today too. But things around your business, obviously, as I'm getting to know you folks better from a benefits and other insurances perspective, but maybe for the audience on it, Kybert has been a wonderful client of ours as well. Just anything particular you want to ask questions on or hit directly that might be pertinent to your organization, or ways that Kybert could just give you some of their experiences in the field as well.
Well, I think one of the things that I think on a number of fronts surprises us at times. We have a friend of ours that I could talk to two different instances that I found out in the last 2 weeks, one of them, and one probably 9 months ago. Friends of ours that are IT staff inside a company, and they got breached and spent days or weeks trying to recover. And my first question to both of them was, who did you call first? Did you call your cyber insurance carrier? Did you call their hotline? How did you engage in order to get them back, your computers, the firm that you work for, back up and running? And both of them came back and said, we don't have cyber liability insurance at the company I work for. And one of those, these are not tiny firms. One's probably 30 to 40 users. The others probably in excess of 150. And I said, how's that possible? And of course, we're going to come to this in one of the slides that's coming up. We don't have multi-factor authentication. We thought it was too much trouble, so they wouldn't insure us. And I said, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I said, there's a million ways to get MFA installed. People don't like it. It's challenging. I said, how is it rebuilding 142 machines from scratch? And, that's weeks of working 20-hour days. I think it was 3.5 weeks to get them back up and running. So it's situations like that when I start to think about, not just the value of the data, but the value of operating the business in itself. How can you forget productive, just operational at all? I think you have to think about at that moment. I mean, is that the type of thing you're talking about, Sean? Or is there something else?
Yeah, just engaging, attendees and clients on interactively on what they're seeing, or way we might guide the presentation to from a real world standpoint of things going on in the business. I think those are a couple of them, just with all the confusion out there of how the insurance landscape's approaching things, and also what securitization at the user side should be applied to as well.
Yeah, and I probably can give you one other quick example. We got a call years ago. It was probably 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. In the morning, late morning, a owner of a company walked into his office, turned his machine on, went into his email. There was one message in there. And the message said, we've possession of all of your data. You'll be getting a ransom notification. And we're talking, literally tens of thousands of messages all gone because they had cracked into his Microsoft 365 account. And, he called us within 2 hours. We were helping him out. We, got access. We got the threat actors out of the system, all the things that we do every day to try to alleviate people's problems and get them back to operational. And of course, we asked the magic question, you know, did you call your cyber carrier? He said, yes, I already did. I put them on notice. They're going to be providing some forensic assistance in order to determine exactly how this happened, blah, blah, blah. Weeks, maybe even a month later, I spoke to the owner after he became a client from this situation. I said, you know, how did you make out with the cyber insurance? And he said, they denied the claim. I said, why did they deny the claim? I said, because, you know, you told me you have coverage. He said, well, when we filled out the application for service, we said we've got multi-factor authentication on everything and for every user, and 5 users did not. And of course, he was one of the 5 users. And that's an automatic denial. It's fraud. You said you had it. They already proved that you didn't. He all but admitted that he didn't. And that's claim denial. So these are the things that we talk about and even struggle with every day to make sure that enforcement is in place when it comes to, I'll just say security tools in general. And multi-factor is the big one, but you know, there's probably 11 others that apply that have to be in place in order to, if you're saying they're in place, I've got backups. I back up every day. It's, you know, all that stuff.
And Rob,
Um,
anything you're seeing from a standpoint of just Grandy or issues that you might be wanting to tackle from a authentication standpoint or a cyber standpoint that we can kind of directly interact with you on too from a Grandy standpoint? And if you're not able to drop voice in, maybe just drop a chat and we can answer questions too. But we'll continue going through some of the slides too. I just figured, given some of the audience, maybe we can incorporate some very specifics into the folks attending.
Absolutely happy to talk about, you know, any specific situation. And trust me, we've got plenty of things we can talk about and, you know, where we've been called in and to assist.
I think
Well,
really frequently,
yeah.
Bob, what I hear you saying often around the cyber liability insurance policies and applications is our clients will come to us and say, hey, we filled this out. Just want you to double check it for us, because they're looking for somebody to check the box and say it's all set. And
Right.
why don't you tell people
Okay.
what you normally see and then how you act after that?
Yeah, no, I think your description is spot on, Mike, because I do get these sort of after the fact asks from clients that say, yeah, I think I've got it all right. You know, to just, you know, sanity check it, you know, just take 5 minutes and take a look at it. Now, first of all, everybody should be aware that these applications, whether they're first-time applications for cyber insurance or their renewals, are not your little one-page 5 quick question thing. Do I have a backup? Do I have antivirus? You know, blah blah blah. You know, they're digging deep because they know there's risk there, and underwriters want to know exactly what's in place. And I'll get these 5, 6, 7, 8-page questionnaires sent over to me, and I look at them. I can remember one of these. It was a relatively short one. It's probably 2 pages, and 80% of the questions were answered incorrectly. They say, "Oh yeah, but we have MFA on everything." I said, you don't have MFA on anything. We've
And
talked
where do
about
you think,
this a dozen times, but
Bob? Yeah,
Yeah.
when you get to that level of confusion, Bob, and have you think part of it is, and obviously there might be some bias in this, right? Obviously, I think high regard of a partnership we have with you and on multiple fronts, but do you think it's just what they've been
Mhm.
sold or feel like they bought differing from what they actually have also?
um, I suppose there is some sort of, I don't know if I want to. I think what I hear is, well, we must have these things, or we think we have these things. And I know the answer is supposed to be yes. So I'm going to, quote unquote, this is the client speaking, err on the side of caution, not caution, conservatism, but more caution, I'm trying to figure out a way to protect myself. And because of that, you know what? I think it's we probably have some of this, so I'm going to say yes to the question. And I'm, some of them, yeah, you could probably say there's maybe gray area there, but when you get to stuff like, do you have backups of all your data? Is it, unencryptable? Is it located in the 3 or 4 different places so that it cannot be damaged or corrupted in any way? If you have, if you're doing it on a regular basis, can you get back to that data and get it back quickly? What's your typical outage and recovery time? People, some people have never been faced with having to either answer that question or think about that before, or
Yeah.
haven't thought seriously about it. So that, oh yeah, we could probably recover in whatever the amount of time was, 4 to 8 hours. And, if they have our system in place, I agree with that statement. It's probably less than that. But, you have to really step through, why is the question being asked? I've got people that say, oh yeah, I have my data backed up, and they've got it onto some USB drive that's attached to their machine, where, we say that is absolutely not a backup, because your machine gets hit, that's going to get hit too. And if that's the only place you have it, you have no data. It's all gone at that moment.
Sure.
So I
And as we
think
think about, I think the
that type of
segue
thing.
too, if we look at the data piece there, I know we've got some slides, and we could hop back into the presentation too, just around the kind of data at risk and the consequences of a breach too, I think, are our next couple of slides. But that might be the perfect segue into, I think some people forget maybe also the data they have stored and what is at risk from getting, taken.
Yeah.
And before we jump into that, before we jump off of that topic, comment was put into the chat that enabling MFA for non-tech forward companies, sadly more challenging than it seems. Suspect that many entrepreneurs don't fully understand what MFA actually means and are relying on an inaccurate understanding. And, we see that every day. They don't understand it, so they're afraid of it. They think it's another step. It's going to slow them down. It's going to be a big problem. It's going to prompt me all the time. I'm going to get prompted constantly during the day. And it's really not true that that's what happens, but they talked to one person who didn't get it and had a problem with it, or it wasn't implemented as effectively as it could have been. And now that's their belief. And we spend a lot of time educating people on that. Thank you, Robert, for that comment. With that, Bob, why don't you jump forward into the slides, and let's see if we can cover some of these other topics.
Understood. So what we're talking about here on the screen is, if I get breached, what kind of impact is this going to have? And, everybody talks about, stuff like financial loss, because, they can't operate the business. Fines can be, and I had a discussion at this conference I'm at yesterday with somebody, and that they had a situation where, per record, the fine is $5,000, and there's like a $250,000 cap on that piece, but there's an extra $250,000 if you fail to report and they catch you. So there's serious fines. The word steep, I guess, does explain it. So there's that, and whether that's covered in a policy and covered up to the level that we're talking about is another place to think about. We always talk about, and I hear Mike say this all the time, is loss of business can be, I wasn't able to deliver, and I talked to a client in upstate New York about this probably 3 weeks ago, and I said, what happens if you can't get product? And he said, oh, it happened last year. Somebody got hit with a breach, and they couldn't deliver product for months. I said, what did you do? He said, went and found another vendor, took some effort. And I said, did you go back to them? And he said, absolutely not. They're done. We are never going back to them again, because they weren't able to deliver on something critical that they needed. They're a manufacturer, and it was material that they needed to perform their manufacturing function. So you start to get into there is obviously mistrust, but brand recognition and brand reputation become, paramount, that that information, that story is going to get out, and who else is not going to do business because they weren't able to deliver? So I think that's a really big thing, and it can be deliver service, deliver product, whatever it happens to be. Um, legal issues, it's kind of cascading things that we're talking about here that's impacting your brand. This stuff gets into the news, press releases, the uh, you know, cyber liability insurance companies typically put something into a policy, and Sean can probably talk better than I can about this, but about brand recovery and brand reputation and protection, because they've got people at the ready on that end. And if you ignore that, disregard that piece, you know, I hear Mike talk about what happens if. Are you going to lose clients? Are you not going to get that client that you're in the midst of pitching because they found out that you were breached and they don't trust you with their data and delivery of a service or product? And I think
Yeah, and
that,
Bob, some
that
of that plays
explains
out
both
in the
3 and 4.
totally, and some of that plays out in the real world when it comes to brand and brand recognition or empathy to a breach. You'll see some of the larger companies that have been breached the last few years provide things like, free background check,
Yeah,
free dark
yeah,
web interaction
yeah.
to see if your information's out there. So it is ways we're trying to protect the brand. And that's part of it, obviously, as a give and take. And there is some fine print and every once in a while on those. If you don't elect to go forward with that, like you can't come back to the company with your data. So there's a bunch of
Yeah.
things to work back and forth with from a brand and follow up after a breach, if you are an employer that unfortunately has had a breach.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good
and
point.
even taking the media out of the picture, well, I'm going to screw up the statistic, but it's something like for every one person that somebody tells about how great you are, they tell 25 people about how bad you are when something
Right.
goes wrong, right? And
Yeah,
it's a small world.
that's true, Mike. I mean, it's unfortunate that that's the way things go, that people tell horror stories instead of the good that happens every day. But um, so what is cyber liability insurance? This is um, a specific policy. This used to be done with riders on top of existing policies. It used to maybe be covered under the umbrella of business interruption insurance. As it's evolved over the last, let's call it 5 to 10 years, because it's taken a while to fully grow up and turn into its own standalone entity. You've got something that can protect loss of data, loss of reputation. It does have that service interruption or business interruption piece to it. And in some circumstances, it's got ransomware protection. So if you get ransomed to get your data back, there is potentially a component for that, or even wire fraud. If somebody, this happens every day, I'm sure, cracks into your mailbox of your controller or your accounting or AP person and tells them to wire money or ACH money to a different location because somebody changed banks. And I would venture to say, and I don't know this statistic, so I can't say whether it's right or it's wrong, but I bet 95% of those emails are completely false if you see those come in. You have to have a process, and you've got to figure out a way to be able to validate. And that means picking up the phone and not calling the number in the email, calling the number that you have on file and talking to a person, hopefully not an AI machine that you're familiar with. And there ought to be double checks, even triple checks, depending on the amount of money we're talking about. I think
Yeah,
those
I
are
think there's a
that's
real case study there where AI is getting more sophisticated. So my comment there too is outpacing uh, the
yeah.
threat. So you're getting, these voice schemes tied to AI that might emulate my voice or Mike's voice telling someone to do something, and then it's setting off a sequence of events where money's then passed along, and that person feels like, well, I was just talking to so and so. So they're really getting sophisticated in how they're going about extracting that money too, both in emails, obviously you see, and then more from a voice and actually direct call, and then looping a call back to when you do go for that first check, it being that AI chatbot that's just kind of commenting on where you think you called.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I listened to Microsoft 2 days in a row down here talk about the power of Copilot, and with any luck, that the security and the responsibility that they've taken seriously. But there's a dozen different artificial intelligence engines out there that I'm positive are not being used for good. So your point's well taken, Sean. Why is it important? And, I already gave you probably a couple of examples, but the one big one is downtime and that loss of business that comes as as the trickle down from that. If somebody hits the business and you're out for 3 weeks, and that is not a made up number. That is a typical outage amount of time for somebody that experienced a ransomware hit, a complete outage because the machine has been taken over and has to be rebuilt. That the trickle down is loss of business, and then all the loss of reputation stuff that we talked about. And how am I going, quote unquote, how am I going to pay for this? And cyber liability insurance is the safety net for being able to do this. So I think that's really, really important to understand exactly why you need this coverage and why it's in place. And then the follow on to it is, and I talked a little bit about this before, I'm going to need to be able to investigate and find out how this happened. And forensics is the way to do that. So
Sorry, I jumped the gun there.
That's all right. And whether you're held to specific compliance or not, there are situations where if data is released out into the wild, you don't have to be a HIPAA covered entity on the medical side, because the medical data to be able to be called in by the Attorney General and say, okay, tell me about what happened. That's a requirement. And then, what comes downstream from a penalty and fee perspective, if you've done the right thing up front in the state of Connecticut, there's a program that they put in place years ago that said, if you're following this framework, and the framework that we use is on the list, the NIST cybersecurity framework, and you've got all the protections that it affords you in place, then fines do not apply. Well, yes, you have to prove that you had in advance and that you're following them, and you've got documentation, and you've quote unquote operationalized it. I mean, you've done it over time. Bad things happen to good people, but if they made a best effort at themselves, I think that's really what the state of Connecticut was trying to help people with. And that's why, if they don't have it, fines and penalties result, and hopefully the insurance is going to cover that. This is kind of more of the same. If your data gets destroyed in any way, it's going to take effort, translate effort to money, to be able to recover, forgetting the outage time. Okay, if you need to be able to do that, who's going to pay that bill? How long is it going to take to get the data back up? This is not push a button in 15 minutes, you've got the data back. You're talking significant amounts of data, and in several different places, whether that's physical places or servers or locations. It's going to take time to be able to get you back all that data. Maybe you can run off a backup for a certain amount of time, but at some point you're going to have to restore. And when you do that, that's real money. Losses, I think of lost business, business interruption, and then the cascading. Okay, that's profit loss because it's lost sales or delayed sales. Mike was going down the road of, we've got to notify people if there's a breach. If there's costs associated with doing that. Sean was talking about protections that have to be put in place after the notification. Yes, we're going to have to do credit protection. We're going to have to monitor dark web. All those things have a cost associated with them. And, those things can be covered by liability insurance on the cyber side. And, the resources at the ready. We always have the discussion, who do you call first? And I'm almost of the opinion there ought to be 2 simultaneous phone calls, one to your IT service provider to make them aware of the situation if they aren't already aware, which probably they will be or should be. And somebody else, the owner, principal, is on the phone with the carrier saying, we just had this happen. You've got a hotline. We know you have resources as part of our policy. Help us. And usually it will immediately turn into a complete team call where IT service will be on the phone with the insurance provider and also the C-level or ownership or top level at a firm. Try to make sure that things are done quickly. Everybody wants something done and up and running quickly, but let's say prudently, because we really want to do it in a proper order. We want to make sure that we're not sacrificing the ability to find out how this happened. We want to know right then and there and after the fact what happened and how it could have been prevented. This is kind of interesting, how this has evolved. If we go back, I mean, I don't know, Sean can probably tell us how long, 5, 6, 7 years, there were multitudes of carriers literally coming out of the woodwork to enter the cyber liability insurance game. And I don't mean to say game like this is playing around, but they were entering at a very low price point in order to grab market share because there was no claims experience. So they were pricing it based on a very low claim volume. And then, of course, ransomware and business email compromise and encrypted storage, all these things started to happen, wire fraud, et cetera. And now claims come funneling in. They have to pay the claims, assuming they meet the obligations and the criteria. And back then, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the criteria for paying these claims did not have the stipulations of security that it does today. Mandated cyber controls, that is a new thing. Even some of the carriers are testing networks before they will even issue a policy to say, we found this, we'll cover you as soon as you fix it. Or we'll cover you, but if that's the cause of the problem, it's not covered until you do fix it. And because the claims came flooding in, less capacity. Why is there less capacity? The inability to pay claims or carriers just losing money and getting out of that pool. They don't want to be in that business anymore because they were burned. So all of this leads, of course, let's go back to economics 101, supply and demand. We've got less supply because all these carriers have evacuated and the pricing has doubled, tripled, quadrupled. Those aren't crazy numbers. That's what's happening because there are less players in the market space. It's just, I hate to say it's just the way it's evolved, but that's what's happened in that market. So, we've touched upon a couple of these things, but I think it's worthy of just bulleting these out and talking. I can't say the words MFA or multi-factor authentication enough. Should be on the top of the list of any technology that's being implemented. And this has something to do with your local computer and your email provider. Let's pick one, Microsoft 365, Google Workspace. But it goes further than that. If you're a lawyer and you have a hosted case management system, that ought to be protected with MFA. With the amount of data that you probably put in there and the amount of PII, and if you're a law firm that does malpractice insurance, how much PHI is probably in there? That's probably measured in terabytes. So those systems ought to be protected with that mechanism. Your storage, I'll just say wherever it is, ought to be encrypted so that if somebody were to steal a machine, get hold of a machine, they don't have access to the data without that encryption key. It's just good hygiene, good practice at this point. And I put it hand in hand with email encryption. I hear every day people, oh yeah, I sent all my tax information over to my accountant. I said, what encrypted email platform do you use? Oh, I just sent it. You know, it was just a PDF. I sent the stuff or an Excel sheet. Really? Well, somebody else has that data now because it's just out in the wild as it's transferring through the email system. So there ought to be a way to protect that, and email encryption is a method. Patching, patching updates, security updates, critical, whatever you want to call it. There ought to be an automated mechanism. This is 21st century. We got to be doing this stuff automatically. We're way too busy, and this is, should be table stakes at this point where it just happens. We do it every week. My machine just rebooted this morning because it applied all the updates last night. That's just the way it is, and it has to be kept up to date. Otherwise, it's exploitable. Unencryptable backup, sometimes referred to as immutable. This means that my backup is in a certain place. If my machine, server, network gets hit with ransomware, my backup isn't also being subjected to that same damage. There is some separation, some method where it cannot be reached by that tool to be able to encrypt the backup and ruin it. That's probably just as important as all the other stuff, because if you get hit and you can't get to your backup, you're going to be one of those 60% of small businesses that go out of business within 6 months if you don't have access to your historical data. That's just the way it is. Everybody talks about this. Employees are the weakest link in any environment, because one wrong click, one misclick, and lo and behold, we all know what's going to happen. They're going to basically lose control of their machine or let somebody in. It won't necessarily be obvious, but you have to keep your employees aware of what's new and the new attempts that are being created. And let's go back to Sean's comment about AI and exactly how easy it is to create and target threats to an organization. You're going to just ask an AI engine, go to DeepSeek, which is over in China, and ask it to do something, and it will build an email campaign for you to be able to deliver ransomware or try to get into an email environment to create business email compromise. We do vulnerability scanning on a quarterly basis to try to find, are there holes that can be exploited that need to be patched, and not patched with automated tools, but have to be manually addressed. You don't know unless you're scanning for these things, and it's really the only way to find some of this stuff. And threat detection, we swear by this since we started implementing it 8.5 years ago. This is looking at literally everything that makes up your computing environment. This is looking at your desktop, laptops, can be servers, 365, Google, anywhere your data is moving around. We're capturing logs associated with it to see if there's an anomaly and if there's some nefarious act going on. And if you're not looking for that stuff, you're going to only catch it by happenstance, and by the time you catch it, will be way, way too late. The attackers are way too sophisticated for you to just catch it by luck. You need to have somebody at a security operations center 24/7, 365 looking at the stuff that's coming in and trying to figure out what's quote unquote not normal.
Great. Well, thank you for all that information, Bob. Any other questions attendees have, please drop them in the chat. Happy to address them specifically on the technical side. And now here we're going to hear from Sean, more on the insurance side, talk a little bit about what's going on out there. Sean, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And again, appreciate everyone's time this morning. Bob, thanks for going thoroughly through and weaving some themes. We'll hit on the insurance piece too. I mean, you'll see in the next sequence of slides a lot of talk around controls and processes and just a little bit more thorough analysis leading up to, the environment we're seeing in the insurance space and getting quotes and premiums rising. So I think, this slide kind of up here from a standpoint of where does insurance fit in? It's obviously a core piece of cyber risk management. It'll be the protector from a financial standpoint in parts. If you do unfortunately have a breach, it'll help you probably get a little bit more sophisticated on the background you have as an employer and where your technology is set up and where it might be vulnerable. And there is, obviously from a standpoint of insurance, like any other piece of insurance, discounts can be applied for implementing those controls. And sometimes implementing those controls are the only way to get the coverage as well. And then, the big piece is obviously if you are breached, expenses incurred after that piece as well too. So, we'll talk through the next slide a little bit in terms of, a lot of change being driven in the cyber insurance marketplace. Some of that is obviously just like other areas of insurance, cost increase. Bob hit something several slides back that really set the foundation for some of these increases. We're not always talking about vulnerability and threats or loss. A lot of the cyber world came to be wildly different than other areas of insurance. So if you look at other areas of property casualty, the medical insurance space, the reinsurance space, it's always based off of math and actuarial tables. In cyber's infancy, there was no actuarial table, there were no claims, which was a compounded problem for future pricing. So when you look at where that brings us up to today, if you had a cyber insurance policy 5 to 6 years ago, you might be up into the 100% of cost increase. We're seeing right now, on average year over year, 10 to 25% increases. And obviously, depending on the risk and depending on the industry, could be, more than that as well. What is kind of being birthed out of the environment are just tighter underwriting requirements as well. Bob mentioned, in the beginning and early days of cyber coverage, a lot of carriers and volume to be written. Now less carriers in the market. So as those carriers have exited, just tighter underwriting guidelines, having an MFA and detailed risk assessments are becoming, not a nice to have, but a need to have. And then just the threats of, we hit a couple slides ago, just ransomware and where that's going, just an elevated level of risk and loss is driving cost as well. And then the kind of drape down and coverage of just third party and supply chain risk. We've heard a number of examples of, it was a vendor that actually had a hole in their setup that allowed someone to back into an employer or with a part of a supply chain issue as well there. So a lot going on, third party and vendor leading to average cost as well. Just the sophistication of risk assessment, and this is again in all verticals of insurance, but one of the things, trying to get smarter and understanding and using AI to understand certain risks within industries, certain ways to ask questions, certain ways to draw vulnerabilities, using a lot of AI and automation in that already process, providing risk scores, and that'll have an impact on both the ultimate price and if something is going to be underwritten as well. There's, obviously regulatory compliance right now continues to be a major theme around covering fines and legal costs around non-compliance. There's a big driver of kind of just smarter risk protocols. You have obviously the piece of incident response and legal coverage around some of that stuff from a forensic standpoint, or legal costs in general start to mount when you are breached. And that includes everything, the follow-up and mop-up after a breach. So we talked about some of those third-party, dark web type things to scan if your data is out there. It includes a lot of that cost as well. And then just, as the data breaches themselves have evolved and become much broader and more sophisticated, also there is the coverage adapting to that too. So you have broader coverage for, again, that big area that we talked about the last slide, third party, and whether that's a vendor or supply chain. We've just seen enormous loss costs in that area from a third party standpoint. And then just, for small and mid-sized businesses, just trying to offer both the tailoring of policies applicable to your business from an industry standpoint, and then the prioritization of having a policy as well, and then the affordability of that. So, like other areas of insurance, as these policies become more cost prohibitive to have, just how can we tailor some of that to your company, coverages specific to yourself, where we're not so thin that we're not covering something, but we're not over covered either for something that doesn't apply to your business. So trying to thread that fine needle from an industry standpoint. Obviously, we're more on the distribution cycle. You don't create as much product on our end, but working with Kyber and going through detailed kind of IT threat assessments and getting everything else does help narrow down the cost, because you will benefit from having certain protocols in place from a discounting standpoint, which does help then with the tailoring of policies and the affordability. Uh, Huge area of focus on business interruption coverage as well. That's been a focus, and more employers asking for that coverage. And I think we've lived through several big events, both data breach and otherwise, around COVID time as well, where you saw a lot of policies did not cover certain elements of business interruption. From a data standpoint, there's been a number of things where a certain machine is down, or you take Bob's example earlier today. If you're that manufacturer that was breached and you lose customers because you're no longer trusted or you were down, covering that as well too. So there's a lot of things we can intermix into the policy coverages there as well, and that's been key focuses kind of in the small to mid market. And then just looking at different causes of loss. So when you look at percentage of total claims and percentage of the material claims, I won't read through all these, but you've heard us weave in some of the themes today, just with ransomware and transfer fraud and all the different mediums of how loss and fraud is occurring. Just threw a few stats up there when you look at kind of the cause of loss and the total claim amount as well. Ransomware does drive a lot of loss. And Bob and Mike, maybe from an interactive standpoint, obviously you guys are on the front end too, and seeing certain ransomware or trying to protect those, or presumably even brought in kind of in the beyond the 11th hour, right? Trying to mop up someone else's mess. But I feel like
Yeah.
this would speak to what you're seeing too from a ransomware standpoint.
Yeah, so we see this stat a lot, Sean, and Mike and I have specifically talked about it. We think that there's probably an intersection between that and the what's on here is transfer fraud,
Mm-hmm.
at a much closer level. I think ransomware in general has probably gotten the lion's share of the press, and the numbers. They used to be very modest numbers when people got hit and a ransomware demand came in. They were in the thousands, or it might not even approach a 5-digit number. That is probably no longer the case, or the rare exception. So that may be driving some of the data that you're showing here. It's not crazy to say, oh yeah, that's a $75,000 ransom, or or substantially more, 2 or 3 times that number. And it speaks to the criticality of the data. If they know they've gotten 10,000 medical records, and you're going to have to release information to Health and Human Services and the AG, and now you've got to notify 10,000 people, and all the cascading events that come after this. They know they've got you, and trying to somehow trust the
Absolutely.
ransom folks, and giving the data back and paying for that. That's almost funny when you think about trusting the guy that just stole your data.
Yeah.
But those numbers on the wire fraud are usually pretty substantial too. Somebody gave an example at the conference I'm at: 65,000 2 days ago to one of his clients, wired the money to the wrong place, not
Yeah.
coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I have was not a client, just to say that, full disclosure of everyone on this call, but a friend of mine, had the AI example of AI mimicking the voice of his CFO, and someone within the company wired 250K out of an account. That does not sound like it's coming back. And now it's involved with CIA and a bunch of other mediums, and they're trying to track it down. But I heard that about a month ago.
And I think to speak to the stat a little bit, we see far fewer ransomware situations than we do, let's say, wire fraud situations, but the ransom ones are far more disruptive. And that's where you start looking at not just the cost of the ransomware payment, but the business interruption and the recovery costs. You know, if you lose your $100,000 wire transfer, your cost is going to be $100,000, right? Plus a little cleanup for how they got into your system. If it's a ransomware and you've got 100 employees and they're down for 3 weeks, you know, those numbers balloon very quickly. And it's very visible to all of your clients that you can't deliver to or that can't get into the systems you had set up for them or whatever it is, where the wire fraud is not quite as visible. And I think that's why the ransomware stuff gets all the press.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, and then we kind of get into, what is cyber liability cover, and we covered some of this, and we weave different themes in, but throw up on this slide, typical coverages, and just from a notification, credit monitoring, the forensic piece, and business interruption. That's ultimately what you're, trying to cover. We've hit pretty much all of these bullet points either in the last couple minutes or throughout today, and obviously the costs associated with any one of these, and you go to the last three bullet points, there's big cost there. So obviously the extortion of getting that data back, if it is 10,000 records, and what that's worth to the user that had that data stolen, or the ransom element of it, and obviously from a legal fee and public relations standpoint, massive cost. So you're really looking to put a policy in place that would prevent, like anything with insurance, you're not looking to put through the $100 claim. You're trying to prevent a claim that would otherwise take you out of business, or make business very tricky from there on out. So that's what we're trying to accomplish in tailoring liability policies from a cyber standpoint for companies. And when you look at potentially covered losses, and you look at that first or third party, again, I would think my tone here, without reading through every bullet point on the slide, we are just seeing a larger volume of third party defenses. So, from a legal standpoint, settlement standpoint, contracts, all these things, just, I think the gateway to all this is just understanding third party and vendors you're working with, and protocols that you want to set for them, ensuring data and moving through an exchange of information. And then two, obviously having a policy and what that would cover in the event that you were breached through a third party is twofold. So some of that goes into the controls and protocols, as well as it does the insurance piece. And then again, from a first party standpoint and what might be covered, a lot of the areas we see, from these bullet points, just calling out a few of them. The forensic investigation is a big one, to try to track this stuff down to the best of the ability. You get into a legal advice perspective, obviously the ongoing credit monitoring and the public relations pieces. Those are several of the ones we're calling out a lot. Then you get into the real world of the loss of money from the theft and the ransomware payments. But as you look at what we're trying to cover, I think this is a pretty good indication, both first and third party, on what the policy is expected to cover. And then the front end of that is how we're building the policy to then therefore cover those things as well. There's a number of things that obviously come into cost and what insurance is made up of. Obviously, a lot of this, there's both the cost element and there's the acceptance of the risk element. And to even be accepted, obviously having some of the multi-factor authentication, the email authentication, understanding, team protocols, team education, and the controls you have in place are a big one, why they're called out here. And it's been a major theme of today. That's going to have a lot to do with the cost. And then obviously there's industry factors and maybe just different industry things that are very specific to financial or payment processing that might not be as common with other businesses. But I would say the thread we generally see, if you're a B2B company, you tend to have some level of data that you're storing on behalf of others. So just going through the protocols and even knowing if it seems like the most innocent business and you're like, well, we're not really exchanging a ton of money over internet, or I really can't see how we're breached, everything from lawn care through wire transactions, you do have an end user that is giving you some level of their data, and you want to protect that. So the controls to do that and the costs associated with that have everything to do with your business and the protocols within that as well. But a
You
few of
know,
those
Sean,
things called
and
out here. Go ahead.
the one thing I think about, and I heard you say, controls and speaking about procedures and process, um, it a lot of this stuff might seem like common sense, but in someone's haste to do something and believing it to be the right thing to do, shortcuts are taken, and that's how problems and disasters occur. Uh, one of the guys I met with last night, one of his clients was dealing with a new bank rep. He had a process and he asked for money to be transferred. The guy skipped all the protocols that were supposed to be in place at the bank and just sent the money, and of course sent it to the wrong place without the proper authorization. And I understand that the bank is on the hook for that, and I think we could probably all agree with that. But for the moment, the money's gone.
Yeah.
And it could have been exactly the reverse, where the accounts payable person shortcutted the written process that was specifically called out in the application that they filed with their insurance agent, that said, oh yeah, we have a process, it's double signature, or it's two people agreeing to a change of bank account information that has to be authorized. All of those things are contributing factors to exactly why things happen and how things either get paid, claims get paid, or don't get paid. And maybe that's the lead in for what's up on the screen.
Sure.
Yeah, we're down to the last couple of minutes here, so I'll just wrap a bow on all the great information you guys shared. I think at the end of the day, what we like to tell people is insurance is not a blank check. If you're going to get paid, you got to prove that you did your due diligence, you fought the good fight, and you followed the measures that you said you were going to do when you set out in your application. And again, we beat this dead horse, but if you claim to have MFA and you don't have MFA, your claim will likely be denied. Additionally, documentation and execution matters as much as the coverage of that, because you need to prove that you've been doing it. You didn't just set it up. You've got history of that type of stuff. So making sure that you look at that application, you understand what's on there. Again, we see them every day, every week when someone comes to us and says, hey, just take a quick look at this. We think we're all set. It's our renewal. And then we say, well, no, we talked to you about implementing these things, but you never actually did them. I'm not going to sign off on it, because they want to try to transfer the risk from them to us by saying, I didn't know. The insurance company's not going to accept, I didn't know from anybody. And they're going to expect that you do your due diligence and understand what you're signing up for.
Absolutely.
You want to improve your cyber insurance readiness, do your due diligence, have an inventory of the hardware and software assets that you have. Can't say it enough, use MFA for everything. Just because you have it on your email doesn't mean you're using MFA everywhere. You want to use it on every email account. You want to use it on your desktop logins. You want to use it on your apps that you log into in the cloud. Anywhere that it allows you to turn it on, turn it on. Seems like it might be an inconvenience, and it probably will be for about a week, and then it's just going to be something you do. Have a plan in place. Know what you're going to do when the other shoe drops. Know who you're going to call. Have that stuff at your fingertips, and not just a binder with a 70-page plan in the storeroom somewhere, but something you can act on quickly, something that you can enact when you need it. That's what's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of money, getting your business operational again. And we talk about this all the time. Defense in depth is critical. There is no one thing that's going to protect your organization, but having multiple layers of defense, things like the multi-factor, the threat detection, the vulnerability scanning, the endpoint protection, all the different layers. Threat actors know what these technologies do. And so they may be able to get around one, but then the next one might stop them. And so that defense in depth is critical to being able to make sure you've got what you need in place.
Threat actors are lazy and want a quick hit, and if you make it hard for them, they will move on.
That's a great point, Bob. This is me. I'm Mike Jafrida, president of Kyber Security, the third voice on the plan here today. If anybody on this call wants any more information, more direction back towards Bob, towards Sean, or from myself, happy to accommodate that. We will send a follow-up email with all of our contact information to all of the participants. So if anyone wants to reach out, feel free to do so. We are right at 12:30, and so I just want to thank everyone for their attention today, for their time. Hope this was valuable. Thank you, Sean and Bob, for all the great information. Thank you, Brandon from ImageWorks, for putting this all together for us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys.